Welcome to Revolution Report, the show that highlights pressing issues, uplifts community voices, and questions the status quo. I'm Sarah Livings-Walsh.
And I'm Analisa, Venolia.
We felt the need to dive deeper into societal problems and explore subjects from diverse perspectives. So join us in the revolution. In this episode of Revolution Report, we're going to be discussing the growing anti-U.S. military and anti-U.S. imperialism sentiments around the world.
Just a warning that we'll be mentioning some sensitive topics, like sexual slavery. We won't be going into detail, but we just wanted to give that disclaimer in case that's not something you want to engage with right now.
Agreed. Now, let's get into it.
To start us off, we wanted to talk about a lawsuit that was filed last month that people may not be aware of, but we feel is really important to discuss.
On September 8th, 117 Korean women filed a lawsuit against the U.S. military, asking for compensation and an apology for the forced prostitution they had endured for years.
This case is really sensitive, and it needs some historical context to understand. So we'll do our best to provide that.
Before Korea was an independent country like it is now, it went through occupation and colonization through multiple times through its history. The most recent instance was the Japanese occupation from 1910 to 1945. The occupation ended with the end of World War II.
During that time, thousands of Korean women and girls were subject to absolutely horrendous violations of their rights, as they were forced to serve as comfort women for Japanese soldiers. And just so we're clear, the term comfort women is framing the reality of what was happening to them as less severe. These women and girls were forced into sexual slavery.
The Japanese army didn't just do this to Korean women. They did it to women across the globe. However, the majority of the victims were Korean women. This inhumane violation of the women of Korea is still a lasting impact on Korea today.
And you may be wondering how this history is relevant to the lawsuit recently filed against the U.S. military. It's the important context behind the lawsuit, because what these 117 women are suing the U.S. military for is damages and an apology for the sexual slavery they went through to serve the U.S. troops stationed in South Korea for decades.
From the 1950s through the 1980s, tens of thousands of South Korean women worked at state-sanctioned brothels that catered to U.S. troops that were in the country as a result of the Korean War. And while we can't know the exact numbers, we know for a fact that not all of these women did that work willingly. As we stated at the start, these women are filing a lawsuit over the forced prostitution they had to endure.
What these 117 women, and the thousands more who didn't file or have passed away, went through is despicable and inhumane. And the fact that the sexual abuse of Korean women at the hands of a different country's military ended less than a decade before the abuse at the hands of the men in the U.S. military began makes the crimes even more heinous.
Oh, it makes my blood boil. In 2022, 120 South Korean women filed a lawsuit against their own government for its part in these crimes and were rewarded compensation of $10,000 each. In this new lawsuit, the 117 women are asking for compensation of only $7,200 each, which comes out to $842,400 total, under $1 million for lifelong suffering.
Yeah, for decades of sexual abuse. They should be getting so much more. What they're asking for is so small. We wanted to discuss this case not only because we think it's important, but because we feel it is indicative of a growing anti-U.S. military and anti-U.S. imperialism sentiment around the world. While researching this story, we even noticed differences in the framing of the court case in international versus American coverage.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we did. We just discussed framing in our latest episode, so please go check that out if you want to learn more about it. Anyway, a French publication called Le Monde's headline about the case read, quote, South Korean women file landmark forced prostitution lawsuit against U.S. military, end quote. While, simultaneously, the New York Times headline read, quote, in a first, Korean women target U.S. military in suit over protection, end quote. Now, that is despicable. And we have already talked about the New York Times bending a knee, and we've already talked about the Washington Post bending a knee. We've talked about a lot of U.S. mainstream media publications, and I'll say it again, bending the knee.
Mm-hmm. And here they are, protecting our military. In the headline by the New York Times, the U.S. military is framed as the victim of these women by the word target, when the reverse is actually true. And the French publication uses the term forced prostitution in their headline, while the Times only says prostitution. Clearly, the French publication isn't softening the realities of the suit in their headline, like the New York Times is. The Times is using framing in a way that protects the U.S. military, while the French publication's framing accurately paints the U.S. military as the group in the wrong.
And this lawsuit isn't the only instance of growing anti-U.S. military sentiment we wanted to talk about. As our listeners are probably aware, the U.S. loves to have a presence in other countries through military bases. There are countless justifications for this, but it is undeniably a part of U.S. imperialism.
Mm-hmm. The U.S. has had a military presence in Japan since the end of World War II, because Japan is no longer allowed to have their own military aside from their defensive forces. For decades, Japanese locals have complained about the behavior of American troops stationed in Okinawa. In fact, the majority of Okinawa residents want the troops to leave, according to multiple polls over the course of years.
Since 1972, over 6,000 crimes committed by American troops have been reported to Okinawa's police. Imagine how many haven't been reported. American troops have a terrible reputation in Japan and in Busan in South Korea. American troops don't have a great reputation either. The U.S. military actually had to apologize to South Korea in 2020 for the misconduct of its troops in Busan. I am the first person to back our veterans 1,000%. You know, my dad is a veteran and I respect them immensely. But we also can recognize the harm that U.S. imperialism has caused across the globe. We can love and support veterans, but we can also hold U.S. troops accountable for atrocities.
Absolutely, and we should, because in my mind, part of a genuine love is also calling out your loved one when they do wrong. And it would be ignorant to assume that our troops have never done anything wrong when they were in another country. We know that's not true. Now, circling back, the president of South Korea, Lee Jae-myung, affirmed Korea's alliance with the United States on September 30th of this year, but he did at the same time state Korea's intention to build a fully independent military that wouldn't need to rely on outside assistance, aka the U.S. military, to defend itself.
And this anti-U.S. military sentiment isn't confined to Korea and Japan. On October 1st, the head of the United Nations panel that determined that Israel is in fact committing a genocide in Palestine called out the United States for failing to fulfill their responsibility to stop the ongoing genocide.
And we do need to recognize that Trump, at the time of recording, claims to have negotiated a ceasefire in Gaza. This ceasefire was immediately broken by Israel, with them killing dozens of Palestinians mere hours after the ceasefire was declared.
The Trump administration also proposed a peace plan for Israel and Palestine to the UN that is already getting called out by international reporters. A headline for a piece by the correspondent for the Carnegie Endowment about the plan reads, quote, "Is this U.S.-Israel-Gaza peace plan a deal or a distraction? The piece discussed how the plan has derailed serious talks about broader peace, actually grounded in international law."
Mm-hmm. And all of this is happening a month after the U.S. imposed sanctions on Palestinian groups that asked for investigations into Israel's war crimes. Also, we're not alleging anything, but the timing of the Trump administration introducing this plan to the UN is interesting.
Agreed.
Especially considering we've known for months that the UN was also investigating the U.S.'s role in the atrocities happening in Gaza. And this plan was introduced mere days after the UN report confirmed that genocide was indeed happening, shifting the attention from that report to this plan. Just something to think about.
Yes, and also something that I did want to bring up on this episode, since I knew we were talking about the Israel-Gaza, let's call it a genocide, and we are calling it a genocide. Mm-hmm. But the reason why the U.S. and other countries around the world have not called it a genocide, because by law, that means they have to take action.
Yeah, and we are shirking our international legal obligation to stop what we know is a genocide.
By law, they would have to intervene.
Yeah, because those laws were put into place post-World War II. Mm-hmm. To ensure that something like what Nazi Germany did would never happen again.
Right.
And yet here we are.
We have all seen the horrific footage coming out of Gaza, and that is not AI, that is not propaganda, that is quite literally on the ground reporters and hospital workers and nurses getting bombed each and every day. And we refuse to call it a genocide because we don't want to get involved. No. We've already been involved.
Yeah. Where does Israel get their weapons from?
But that's the point I was just about to bring up. That is why we are being investigated as a country along with Canada.
Yeah.
Which we talked about in an earlier episode.
We did.
We supplied those weapons. It boggles my mind that it has taken this long for any amount of sympathy for Gaza.
Yeah.
This is all to point out that international sentiment is growing against the United States and its military. These examples are not the only examples, of course. There are countless examples. Take a look at South America, for one. You know, maybe that's a topic for a later episode if you guys want it, and we would love to do that. Mm-hmm. But we wanted to highlight these instances to push back against the nationalistic propaganda that the U.S. pushes upon us constantly.
Absolutely. And take these examples as a reminder to question the narratives that you're fed, especially ones about your country and military. In the U.S., we're constantly told that other countries need our help and are so thankful for our military presence in their countries, that we're the world's hero. But clearly, that isn't always how the rest of the world feels.
No, and so take that into consideration as you look for your news. Mm-hmm. Try to get a global stance on it. Mm-hmm. As we stated in our episode, it's really important to question the media messages you receive. We mentioned some independent journalists we love, and in this episode, we wanted to share some international news organizations. We think having a global perspective on news is very important. It's easier to see the framing that's happening in media when you can compare articles against each other like we just did.
Exactly. So to that end, here are some of our favorite international news organizations. Le Monde, the French paper that we mentioned earlier. Al Jazeera, an organization based in the Middle East, and they are doing spectacular coverage of Israel's genocide of Palestine. The Guardian, a reputable British paper, and Reuters, another reputable paper with coverage of over 200 countries.
And there's a fantastic resource called Ground News. It shows you how different sides of the political spectrum are covering stories, identifies blind spots, and shows you who is funding coverage for stories. So we definitely recommend you check it out.
Absolutely. And we know this episode talked about some difficult topics, but we felt they were important to discuss.
Yeah.
And we hope that you take away the message that having a well-rounded international perspective on the news that you consume is really important. That's how you can help fight against propaganda. And that's one of our goals here at Handball Court Radio, fighting against propaganda.
And it has, from the very beginning, and it always will be.
That's about it for this episode. We hope it was informative.
As always, you can check out our website, handballcourtradio.com. You can also follow us on Blue Sky at Handball Court Radio. And you can also follow me there at Sarah Livings-Walsh.
I'm there as Not Like Mona Lisa. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you like, subscribe, and share so you don't miss our content. And don't forget to rate, review, and follow us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts.
And with that, I'm Sarah Livings-Walsh.
I'm Analisa Venolia.
And this has been Revolution Report.
Well,